The workday was pretty much routine for Zhou Lin until her body began sending her familiar messages that she readily understood. As a director of a publishing media, Zhou Lin wasted no time to cease working and leave the office in a hurry. Fortunately, it was just a short walk to the nearby 87th Army Hospital, and after getting checked in, she gave birth to a baby boy about 20 minutes later. Zhou Lin was now the mother of 6 sons and a single daughter. So began the life of Zhang Kesha on May 23, 1962, in the city of Dalian, China. Despite producing a nice, healthy baby, Zhou Lin could not mask her disappointment. She so wanted another daughter, but it just wasn't to be. Her husband, Changsha Zhang, on the other hand, was quite pleased to have any gender, for he made it previously known that his desire was to ultimately have 10 children. Almost immediately, Zhou Lin made a fateful decision. She secretly arranged surgery to assure her family's growth had reached its limit. When Changsha Zhang learned of this, he was somewhat annoyed for not being informed of this earlier. Nevertheless, the Zhang family moved forward, and the 7 children were all cared for in an equally loving manner. It was in 1960 when Changsha Zhang was assigned to Dalian to be rehabilitated due to his declining health. Promoted to the rank of a general in Mao's army in 1955, Dalian was part of his northern command area where he was to get his health restored, all related to serious stomach issues. His current health could be traced back to his earlier army years of 1934-1935, when the famous Long March occurred. Mao's army found it necessary to make a strategic retreat from his Civil War enemy, the Kuomintang forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The march lasted but a year or so, but it was brutal in so many ways. Mao's communist forces were equipped with inadequate clothing, and some soldiers lacked even shoes. Lack of food, coming under attack by air almost daily, and combat skirmishes from the pursuing Kuomintang, it had been estimated but 10% of the original forces that Mao started with actually survived to reach their destination in Shanxi. Of those that survived, Changsha Zhang was not alone with his serious stomach problems. Even Mao Zedong had suffered for years with his digestive system. The route of the march took them over unforgiving areas of relentless barren landscape, allowing nothing to eat except grass, weeds, and selective roots, washed with snow during the winter if they were fortunate. Anything edible had to be consumed raw, and there was no means to cook. The history of the Long March seemed to record only the exploits of Mao's army of men, but there are accounts that up to 32 or so women were included within the tens of thousands of his soldiers on this grueling journey. The wives of some of the upper echelon made up part of the numbers. Despite the overwhelming loss of life and the lifelong health issues of the survivors, the Long March has been glorified and proudly immortalized for all of China to remember. No disputing the nightmarish issues that they faced, and one can easily question how anyone could survive the daily tortures that were encountered just to live and fight for another day. Bitter cold weather took its toll of the health of Changsha Zhang at various stages of his life, and the Korean conflict was no exception. Newly promoted to the rank of general, he found himself in North Korea as a military advisor during what resulted as the bloodiest engagement of 1952, known as the Battle of Triangle Hill. What was supposed to have been a short skirmish, it went on for nearly a month and a half in October and November. Casualties were staggering on both sides, but the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, or the PVA, maintained control of the strategic elevated forested hill. It wasn't until the armistice was signed in 1953 when hostilities came to a halt, and to this day, no peace treaty has been signed. 1964 and 1965 were pivotal years for the Zhang family. Sufficing on meager rations allotted to the general, his weight loss continued, now down to 50 kilograms or 110 pounds. His digestive system was not getting the nourishment he desired and needed. Consulting with his doctors in need for a solution, the general was simply informed it was best to make arrangements for his imminent death. There was nothing more they could do. Zhang was spurred into making a hasty decision. If he is to die, he will do so in his home area and not in Dalian. To do so, he had to take leave from the army, and getting approval after submitting his request for early retirement, the former general made final arrangements to take his family to Changsha. Sometime prior to leaving Dalian, the retired general suffered another setback. He lost his dear mother, Li Zhang, during an afternoon meal. With all the family members gathered at the table, his mother was getting sleepy and complained that she was so tired. Slowly and gently, she laid down her rice bowl and chopsticks and proceeded to fall asleep into her eternal rest at the age of 84. Li Zhang was more than just the mother of a very respected general in Mao's army. Her earlier life was truly awe-inspiring, proving that the love and devotional bond between mother and son was well established and cherished to the end. In the early 1940s, Li Zhang, a widow who had just lost her husband years earlier, was living in a small village of Ch4, the original family home where the general was born in 1911. Life was uneventful for the most part, and having acreage for plantings, she was the recipient of a portion of the crops. One day, however, a trusted neighbor informed her that the Kuomintang soldiers were searching nearby villages looking for followers and relatives of Mao's army. Going door to door seeking them out, Li Zhang was sure to be found and executed on the spot. Spying on one another and divulging information to the interested forces was quite common, and the lives of women and children meant nothing to the enemy. Li Zhang was in a panic, and with only the clothes she was wearing, fled from her home to seek temporary safety in the nearby hills. This was the beginning of her 6-year journey on the run to avoid being captured by the Kuomintang forces. Not knowing how she was expecting to survive, she was just determined to hopefully make contact with friendly forces. When she encountered members of Mao's army, the name of her high-ranking son was given over and over. This same scenario was played out, but each time the name of Zhang was mentioned, it was not recognized. In the meantime, her avoidance of enemy forces made it necessary for Li Zhang to flee from the province to province and forced to beg for any food that was to be had. But like the famous Long March, grass, weeds, roots, and the like were all that kept this woman going. For all of 6 years, braving the bitter cold winters, rainstorms, and anything else that Mother Nature threw her way, Li Zhang continued to log mile after mile, not about to quit. Finally, her luck changed in 1948, when someone in Mao's army unit recognized the name of her son. Her fortunes were finally rewarded, and Li Zhang was now in good hands. The army unit was diligent to assure her safety in meeting up with Zhang. After all these years, mother and son were never to be separated again until her passing in 1964. The life of the future General Zhang was actually debated by his parents in 1912, a year after his birth. China was in the throes of a deadly plague, and countless children were helplessly succumbing to it. Zhang was the youngest of 4 family children, and by chance, a group of a Christian missionary was in the area, giving inoculations to children, but at a cost. The Zhang family, like all others, were poor and had little money to pay. For only one of the 4 children, father and mother were forced into a situation that no parents would ever wish to get involved, deciding which child will have a chance to live and sacrificing the others. Father Zhang suggested that the oldest 12-year-old son be given it since he would be allowed to work. The mother, however, argued that the youngest should be given a chance to have some life years. Mother worn out, and the future general was assured a lease on life. Without additional funds, the 3 remaining children sadly fell victim to the plague. Homeward Bound. There's an old proverb, home is where the heart is, and to the retired general, that would mean only one thing. Hunan Province and its capital city, Changsha, was his home and always was, regardless of where he had lived before. Taking the train from Dalian to Beijing and then directly to Changsha, the family settled into the military retirement home assigned by the Army. Located in the countryside of Changsha, about 13 miles from downtown and next to the East Lake, the property exceeded their wildest dreams. Being a retired general, the expansive lot afforded a panoramic view next to the lake, something afforded only to about a handful of other retired generals in the military retirement community. Lesser grade officers would not have a lake view, but would have nice homes nevertheless. Their house number 9 came with 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and to make their lives more pleasant, a soldier was assigned to see to the needs of the retired general. He actually shared the enlarged bedroom with the older boys, while Kesha slept with his parents in their bedroom. The sister had her own room, and the 4th bedroom was used mostly for storage. The family also had a maid who did the cooking and house cleaning, and she slept in a separate, smaller room. Additionally, a driver was at their disposal, and he stayed in the nearby apartments above the car garage. For the family, a Russian-made Volga was their transportation, and the driver was summoned whenever needed. Zhang had no trouble settling into his new civilian lifestyle and set about landscaping the property. He loved bamboo and various fruit trees, including chestnuts, walnuts, tangerines, and many varieties of peaches, and they were included. The soldier aide worked right alongside the general in the garden. In addition, a large variety of vegetables were planted. So Lin really loved her flowers, and camellias and azaleas were her favorites. Little Kesha picked up where he left off. At the tender age of 3 in Dalian, he made it a point to dress as a girl and to play with girls and dolls. He was fully accepted to be with them, and Changsha was no different. Even with the older girls, Kesha fit right in. He and some of his girl playmates would spend hours fishing, mostly for the shrimp that was a popular dish with the Zhang family. Once Kesha got a little older, he would observe his mother carefully in the kitchen and would prepare food when only 5 years of age. Too small to reach the stove, he stood on a bench to proceed with what he knew, stir-fry shrimp with egg and egg-fried rice. All the while he would have the maid cook pass him the seasonings he called for. Impressed with his expertise, she thought it was hilarious watching him being a chef. Wishing to dress as a girl, Kesha made it easier for his mother. Hand-me-down clothing was the norm with families to help with the household budgets, and Kesha was the recipient for clothing from his siblings, brothers and older sister alike. The health and welfare of the Zhang family improved immensely once they moved to Changsha in 1966. Life was good, and they were adjusting well in their new environment. China, however, was about to plunge into political chaos when Mao Zedong unleashed his infamous Cultural Revolution that was to bring the country to its knees. With the intent to root out enemies of the bourgeoisie or the capitalistic class of the PRC, it instead wreaked havoc on the masses, sparing few. It was in 1968 when the peace and tranquility of the family's retirement community was suddenly and unceremoniously intruded by a horde of Red Guards. Each and every home was entered without permission, and personal belongings that appealed to them were taken. The general's prized war souvenir, a long knife he claimed fighting the Japanese, was seized by the Red Guard leader. Proudly displaying it to his followers, he carelessly pulled the knife from its sheath and cut himself severely. Throwing down the knife, the Red Guard leader hurried to the medical clinic to get treatment. In the meantime, Kesha's maternal grandmother stood and pressed her reading material to her body, glaring menacingly at the intruders and pounding her cane to the floor. She angrily shouted, "You will not take my book of Pu Yi." And they didn't. Everything taken from all the houses was placed in the conference building, and when the Red Guards left the area with what they wanted, the remaining property was left for the rightful owners to retrieve. Kesha's mother lost some of her books, and a small bore rifle that the boys used to shoot birds was gone, as well as the stamp collection. The Japanese knife became cursed by the Red Guards for drawing blood and was left behind. The Zhang family readily took it back. Fortunately, this was the only encounter the community had to face with the Red Guards, as their rampaging students were fast losing power and were being dealt with severity by the People's Liberation Army. But the movement would not die out until 1976, the year that Mao Zedong died. General Zhang's health was being restored quite well since he returned to Changsha. The winter of 1968, however, was to give him another setback. Mao Zedong issued a summons to the high-ranking officers to go to Beijing to meet with him, and the sheer number of arrivals proved to be overwhelming. Due to the limited space inside the building, the many large designated groups were forced to wait outside for hours in the bitter cold to wait for their turn to enter. The general now would have future health problems to deal with, asthma and pneumonia, making it necessary to be in and out of hospitals for the rest of his life. For many years he had been smoking a pipe, but he gave it up. In 1971, Kesha was a 9-year-old third grader who had a birthday he would never forget. Receiving small gifts of money, his maternal grandmother informed Kesha that his mother should be receiving a gift from all the sacrifices she has made for his benefit. So with his meager amount of money, Kesha set out to purchase a small bouquet of plastic flowers for his mother. That little gesture made Zolin very happy, and a new tradition was born. Whenever Kesha was to have a birthday, gift-giving became twofold. Kesha saw to it that Mama would receive a bouquet of plastic flowers, or as time went on, nice clothing and then money every year until she died in 2002. Kesha began middle school in 1975, and he continued to dress in a combination of boy and girl clothing. While still being subjected to taunts of fake girl, he had never experienced any bullying, but some things never changed. Needing to use the restrooms, he always had to avoid them during a class recess. He would wait until class was in session when he got permission, knowing that the bathrooms would be vacant. Strangely enough, young Kesha was also selected to be a Red Guard in 1975 while he was in middle school. His job being an announcer to all the rooms wired for sound, he read notes given to him and have responses from all the students as to the political wills of various officials. They would proceed to praise or denounce whichever notion was popular. He was proud to be selected as a Red Guard, and the students in the school admired his position. The last school years. Middle school and high school were in the same building, and the distance of 6 miles from home made it necessary for Kesha to have transportation. Although Kesha's father gave him lunch and bus money, he missed the bus too many times. Ultimately, he elected to ride a bicycle to school and kept the money his father continued to give him. As always, the fake girl label continued to follow him from time to time, but he simply ignored the issue. Kesha was on a mission, and he was not about to be denied. Being on time was an important issue in high school, and Kesha's father gave him some money to buy a watch. Not just any watch, but a Shanghai brand watch, which was considered to be of fine quality. Getting to the department store where the watches were sold, Kesha noticed a photography store next door. A Great Wall 135 camera caught his eye, and he decided to buy it. Returning home without the watch displeased his father, but his mother was overjoyed. They had never had a camera until now. Knowing that Kesha still needed a watch, she gave him her little gold watch to take to school, and the student possession of a watch was expressly prohibited, for even teachers could not afford one themselves. It was necessary for Kesha to keep it hidden and never wear it openly. Kesha began high school without any fanfare in 1977, and while all health concern had always been centered on his father, the following year was a shocker. Kesha himself was experiencing a number of health issues. At the Changsha Army Hospital, tests were revealed that he was suffering from the effects of low blood pressure and low sugar. Kesha was under a lot of stress, unbeknownst to anyone else. He felt the gender issues were the cause. The doctor at the East Lake Clinic advised Kesha to get more rest, and one semester of school would be lost. It was during this time that Kesha's father was admitted to the Changsha Army Hospital for his ongoing lung problems, and Kesha was to stay with him for the 4 weeks of his treatment. It was here that Kesha was to meet a young man that was to impact his life with a promising new hope. He was staying with his father just a few doors away from Kesha's father, and Kesha and his new friend, Kesha Zhang, would spend time together every day on a long balcony attached to the building, furnished with tables and chairs and offering a beautiful view of the distant river and bridge. They would discuss the meaningful goals of their lives. After dinner, the two would walk to the river and bridge many times. Kesha was very surprised to learn that Zhang knew of his dilemma. "You are famous," he would reveal to him, for it became well known that Kesha related to being a girl simply by his apparel. Zhang informed Kesha that there was a way to change one's sex, and since it was his desire to go to medical school, he would do Kesha's operation in the future, and then they could get married. Kesha was all for this plan. Zhang and his father left the hospital days before Kesha and his father, but not before Zhang gave Kesha a parting gift. A tube of lipstick would be a reminder that sometime in the future it would be put to good use. Both vowed to stay in touch, and the 3+ weeks together were very uplifting to Kesha, and they soon were exchanging letters. It was Zhang's wish to go to medical school, and knowing that Kesha liked military men, Zhang decided to join the Army and later attend Army medical school. By late 1978, Zhang was taking his medical training at the Guilin training camp. Unfortunately, by early 1979, the letters ceased to arrive to Kesha. It was later, when Kesha was back in school, that Zhang's brother appeared there to break the sad news to him. Zhang was killed in the border war with Vietnam in March of 1979, and upon hearing this, Kesha was completely devastated. A promising future was shattered, and he had no idea what to do next. Overwhelmed with grief, he wasted no time leaving school and returning home, staying there for several months, all the while Kesha burdened with guilt for encouraging Zhang to join the Army. By late 1979, Kesha made a startling declaration to his family. "I'm going to join the Army. I want to be a man." The Zhang family members couldn't have been happier. They would never expect such a turn of events. Kesha made it a point to return to school in the fall to inform his teachers and fellow students of his decision. Teachers and classmates alike were happy, just as his family members were. Little did they realize it was merely a ploy to take attention away from his dedicated quest to become a woman. On December 4th, 1979, Kesha officially joined the Army. For the first 2 weeks, he experienced hard farm labor at the Guangzhou military farm. Upon transferring to Foshan training camp for a month and a half, he learned how to march and shoot a rifle and throw hand grenades. Once he finished his training in Guangzhou, his father used some influence to have Kesha stationed at the Army General Hospital in the same city where the general would have his medical treatments. His mother also would be there, sometimes being treated for her heart condition. It was not unusual for Kesha to have guard duty at the entrance to the facility and smile and wave to his mother when she observed her son from her balcony. At some point, Kesha was transferred to the kitchen of the cafeteria where he would serve out his military service. His duties were to help prepare the food items to be cooked, and the meals were for the hospital staff only. While Kesha and the other kitchen workers ate where they performed their duties, they ate just as well as the staff. Working days in the cafeteria kitchen, Kesha went to night school at the Guangzhou Middle School to take typing and English lessons. A good family friend who worked at the nearby Liuhua Hotel made it possible for Kesha to be introduced to the manager of general services. This allowed him to practice his English and assist hotel guests with a number of their concerns. During this particular time, the Canton or Guangzhou Trade Fair was operating, and Kesha was approached by a couple of hotel guests who happened to be there for the fair. Needing to make a long-distance telephone call from their hotel room to the home area of their Bahamas, Kesha's assistant made it possible for them to do it. Taking a liking to Kesha, they asked if it was possible to take the sights in for Guangzhou. Since the next day was Kesha's day off, he offered to show them around the city. While doing so and having a lunch and a tea break with them, Kesha opened up to reveal what he had hoped to achieve as early as possible. Initially, the couple asked if he was a homosexual. Kesha emphasized no, he was only interested in having a sex change. The couple suggested that he would have more success if he went to the Bahamas or the USA, for China was not known to have performed any sex changes. The couple, having no children, entertained the notion of adopting Kesha to make his dream come true. But thinking all along that he was much younger, Kesha revealed that he was 19 years of age, and any adoption had to be ruled out. At some point later, Kesha's interest to emigrate to the Bahamas or America to get his needed surgery came to the attention of Kesha's father. The family firmly opposed of this plan, with his father suggesting that he could easily be kidnapped and end up in slavery. Perhaps they were just scare tactics, but Kesha did not go along and heeded his father's advice and abandoned such notion. With the Canton Trade Fair finished, the Bahamas couple flew home, and Kesha assured one another that they would keep in contact. In the meantime, Kesha continued with his duties in the kitchen and made the acquaintance of a young nurse who was also from Hunan. Once she was aware what Kesha was planning for his life, she offered to help. Kesha received 2 female hormone shots a month apart, but the deputy director of the hospital happened to observe the second shot. Nothing was said or done, so Kesha looked forward to shot number 3 the following month. When he received it from the same nurse, Kesha noticed something was wrong. He began growing a mustache and hair on his arms, and a nurse who had trusted him had obviously violated their friendship by giving him a male hormone shot. Most likely it came about by having the deputy director instruct the nurse to switch the gender shot. Kesha became very angry and soon changed his grooming habits. He soon began to let his hair grow long and having an occasional perm. Wearing kitchen work clothes full-time and never in uniform, his appearance was never questioned. But time was on Kesha's side, and his army service soon came to an end. By February 1982, he was on his way home to Changsha with his parents. Kesha became very angry and soon changed his grooming habits. He soon began to let his hair grow long and having an occasional perm. Wearing kitchen work clothes full-time and never in uniform, his appearance was never questioned. But time was on Kesha's side, and his army service soon came to an end. By February 1982, he was on his way home to Changsha with his parents. The new Kesha, with his military service behind him, returning back home with his parents in February 1982, and having all the family united was very heartwarming. All Kesha needed at the moment was to have a job to earn some money, and that was to come by the assurance of the Changsha government. But fate handed Kesha another setback. A bureaucratic nightmare developed when the Changsha government and the Guangzhou Military Hospital couldn't seem to agree on Kesha's gender. The Changsha government protested that Kesha joined the army as a man and came home as a woman. Not so, argued the hospital. Kesha was always a man who merely took on the appearance of a woman. No decision or of agreement would be forthcoming, and Kesha was still out of work. Difficult economic times made it necessary to ration all food items, and each member of the family was allowed to purchase limited foodstuffs with their own ration books. Without a job, Kesha had no rations, and he obtained his food from his family's combined rations allotment. This was disturbing to Kesha, to live off the family's meager food supplies, and it became 3 months without employment. He decided he had to leave Changsha and seek work elsewhere. Kesha contacted his friend Miss Yu Hua at the Lihua Hotel in Guangzhou for help, and meeting her in that city, they went to Shillong, a nearby small town, to meet one of their 3 owners of a toy factory. Assured of a job as a toy assembler, he was set up in a dormitory room with 2 young ladies, and then had a lunch with Yu Hua and the manager. The beauty appearance of Kesha and working with mostly women grew no suspicions, and no one was any the wiser of his true gender, and that included the owner who hired him. At some point, that owner communicated with a second owner in Hong Kong, and Kesha's appearance was a topic of interest with Chu Shi. Obviously impressed with the detailed descriptions, Mr. Chu arrived at the factory bearing gifts of candy and various food items to make an impression. Kesha's height as well as his beauty impressed Mr. Chu, for he himself stood at 6 feet 3 inches. From June 1982 until late fall, Mr. Chu made his monthly trips to the toy factory, and Kesha continued to be the recipient of various gifts, always food items, including Coca-Cola, clothing items, a purse, shoes, and even some swimming wear, which he wore one time when they went swimming in the river. A dinner would be had before Mr. Chu headed back to Hong Kong. Doing a little shopping in October, Kesha decided to buy a certain publication, as he had randomly done in the past. An article about China's most famous novel, A Dream of Red Mansions, had got his attention, and after reading it, a decision was made to contact the writer, Professor Fang Bu Ran. Kesha wrote him a letter to Beijing explaining that he was not a homosexual, but simply wanted to change his sex. The professor suggested that he come to Beijing and he would introduce a doctor to Kesha that possibly could help. Kesha was elated to pursue this opportunity of hope. When November arrived, Kesha informed Mr. Chu that he would have to be leaving the factory to go to Beijing to see a doctor, which may possibly necessitate a medical surgery. As a result, he was granted a 3-week leave of absence. By early December, Kesha arrived in Beijing, but not before he alerted his many relatives there beforehand. They were all looking forward to seeing him. For the first 2 weeks, he stayed with his uncle Jiang Wu and family, a convenient location close to the hospital where he hoped to have his surgery. The following day, he met Professor Fang Fu Ran, and, as promised, the professor introduced Kesha to Dr. Li Jiangning while they had a hot pot afternoon meal. It was obvious that both men were impressed with Kesha's girl appearance. The next day, Kesha went to the hospital and was introduced to Professor Dame Wang by Dr. Li, who was also impressed with Kesha's appearance. Professor Wang was also a medical surgeon who earlier had studied in America. After giving Kesha a complete body examination, Dr. Wang gave him assurance that she could do his sex change operation. Professor Dr. Wang then proceeded to send the medical report to the director of the hospital for approval. After about a few days, Kesha was summoned back to the hospital for the decision. He was crestfallen to learn that it was not approved because there was no law in China that allows for such operation. The director of the hospital then relayed the report to the Health Department of China for their consideration. After a week of waiting, Professor Wong had Kesha come back to the hospital for that report. Once again, the report was much the same. No approval because there is no such law to allow it. Also disappointed, Professor Wong asked Miss Kesha what he intended to do. Completely dejected, he said he would just open up a window and walk out. Horrified at such a response, she felt helpless in giving him further hope. Not knowing what to do next, Kesha returned to his Uncle Zhang Wu's house and informed him that he could not get approval for the surgery. What he wanted now was the opportunity to see all his relatives before returning to Changsha. His next visit was with Uncle Zhang Chen and his Japanese auntie Rei Shui, staying with them for 2 nights. This uncle and aunt actually met in the early 1940s, while both were students at the Tokyo Imperial University. Soon they were married and they returned to China to get involved in the war against the Japanese. Both joined the Communist Party and were later to become professors. But Auntie Ray was also a medical doctor during that war, with credit for saving many lives of the wounded soldiers. Later, during the Cultural Revolution, she was not subjected to any punishments or humiliation, as her Chinese loyalty and war record were above reproach. Auntie Ray was obviously fond of Kesha and spent a lot of time giving him much encouragement and dwelling on her past medical skills. She continued telling Kesha that she could do the operation. Auntie Ray was obviously fond of Kesha and spent a lot of time giving him much encouragement and dwelling on her past medical skills. She continued telling Kesha that she could do that operation. Kesha was asked to stay longer, but thanking them, he had to leave to visit other relatives before returning to Changsha. A major turning point loomed ahead that no one saw coming. A 2-week stay with Kesha's auntie Shangxi was most welcome, as they had a very close relationship. Also there, Uncle Wong was the director of China's Department of Metallurgy. The son, Xiao Hong, was instrumental in showing Kesha some of Beijing's sights, and the family talked about Kesha trying to catch up on his life. Xiao Hong had a friend who wanted to date Kesha, but that was simply not going to happen. One day, Kesha was informed by Uncle Wong that tomorrow night after dinner, his driver would take Kesha to an exclusive clubhouse where his uncle, who was a member, would be. Expecting that he was just along for the ride that night with a driver to simply retrieve his uncle to transport back home, they waited in the car until Uncle Wong exited the club house. When he did, he was with another man, and both approached the vehicle. Kesha was then introduced to the director of the Health Department of China. Kesha recognized him immediately, as the director had appeared many times on TV news. After a short conversation, the driver returned Uncle Wong and Kesha back home, and no discussions of that meeting. The next day, Kesha's uncle called the director of the Health Department to inform him that Kesha was actually a boy despite his girl appearance. The director was completely taken by surprise. Auntie Shangxi discreetly informed Kesha soon after that. The next day, his uncle did, in fact, let the Health Department director know of his true gender. In a matter of few days, Kesha was again summoned to the hospital, where his Uncle Shen received a phone call from Professor Dame Wong. The good news spread like wildfire, and when Kesha arrived at Professor Wong's office, a large contingent of well-wishers were on hand to know of the approval of Kesha's long-awaited surgery. Professor Fong Furon, Dr. Li Jiang, Dr. Li Zhifeng, and the latter two would be doing the surgery for the breast implants, and various medical personnel. By now, Kesha came to realize that the meeting of the director of China's Health Department by his Uncle Wong was responsible for a miraculous turn of events. From that point on, Kesha would let his uncle know of his everlasting gratitude for his good fortune. Now there was just one more hurdle to overcome. 3 paper approvals must be granted before the surgery takes place. The next morning, when Kesha once again in Professor Fong's office, he was escorted to the mental health department by Professor Fong Fu Ron. Kesha was subjected to numerous questions and detailed discussions, but he remained unshaken. Finally, the mental health doctor turned to Professor Fong Fu Ron with a simple statement: he is ready. 1 down, 2 to go. That same afternoon, his uncle Zhang Shen and Auntie Ray Shea appeared in Dr. Wong's office and officially confirmed that they were responsible for Kesha's parents. The auntie called Kesha's mother the night before to inform her that the director of the health department gave full approval for the operation, and being assured of its safety, Kesha's parents gave their approval to proceed. Up until now, Kesha's parents had been opposed to the operation since it had not previously been approved. They simply did not want their son to die on the operating table. It being in the middle of winter and of the freezing temperatures, Kesha's parents preferred to remain in Changsha, so Kesha now had family approval. 2 down, 1 to go. The third and final approval had to come from the factory where Kesha had worked, since he was able to obtain a 3-week leave of absence and was assured to retain his employment once he returned. Needing additional time to accommodate the unnamed surgery, it was granted. The first day when Kesha appeared at Dr. Wong's office with the good news, Professor Fong Fu Ron and Kesha prepared and mailed the document necessary to the factory. When received, a copy was made and the factory document letterhead was applied with the approval of the factory manager, and the official chop or the stamp was applied. The document was then sent and arrived to the hospital on January 3rd. Mission accomplished. The next day, Kesha was admitted to the hospital with a surgery scheduled for December 10th. Some days later, Kesha had word to get back to his parents that the operation would be January 18th. All Kesha's relatives were aware of this ploy, so that Kesha's parents would not start worrying about the surgery before January 18th, well after the 10th. With 6 days before the surgery, Kesha was subjected to routine x-rays, blood tests, and exams. To be assured that he really wanted to go forth with the surgery despite possible any medical mishaps, Kesha was bombarded with questions from psychologists. In attempts to invoke fear to test Kesha of his resolve, nothing succeeded. 2 doctors put their opinions forth, one to let Kesha know he would only possibly have 10 additional years to live, the other saying that a lifespan of 40 years would be expected. Kesha put all of this to rest, all these scare tactics, with one profound statement: if I can live just 1 year as a girl, that is good. Kesha proved to be unshakable, for he didn't come this far to turn back. The long-awaited surgery took place as scheduled, 12 hours total, by Professor Dr. Da Mei Wang doing the sex change, and Drs. Li Jiangning and Dr. Li Jifeng inserting the breast implants. The operating room was filled with about 20 people, nurses and medical staff assisting, and also observers. This surgery had garnered much notoriety, and far-reaching implications could be expected since China had no previous experience with transgender applications. The breast implants originally were given to Professor Wang as a souvenir gift before she left America, where she undertook medical studies. Just how long breast implants can remain in place before being replaced is controversial to this day. Some studies state that 10 to 12 years or a maximum of 20 years is the norm, but by the date of January 10th, 2023, it will be 40 years when Kesha had these implants inserted, and to date they have not been replaced. When the marathon surgery was successfully completed, All of Kesha's relatives wasted no time collectively calling Kesha's parents, letting them know all is well and a surgery posed no problems. Kesha was to remain in the hospital up to January 24th until he, now she, was fully recovered. Soon after waking up, Kesha was to have no food or drink, but an auntie discreetly placed a small piece of chocolate in her mouth. Dr. Wong asked Kesha if she was interested in any hormone medications, and while the benefits seemed to sound promising, immediately rejection took hold when mentioned that she would gain weight. Kesha wanted no part of that. As to the post-surgery pains levels, Kesha was so happy with the procedure that she had no recollection of any discomforts, but she was on IV and had no knowledge what it contained. Kesha thought it was somewhat humorous when told not to discuss this event to anyone, yet she had celebrity status when so many patients in her area, mostly individuals connected to sports, came to visit and extended their best wishes. The nurses were very busy chasing them out of her room. Kesha really welcomed them to her room since she had no TV or entertaining devices other than her small Walkman radio. Also, they would bring her food snacks while she was undergoing daily medical tests. The time arrived on January 24th when Kesha was released from the hospital, but not before saying her goodbyes and thanking the staff for all the special treatments. One has to wonder what kind of expenses were incurred from start to finish related to Kesha's entire medical needs while in Beijing. Family and relatives pooling their money to make it work? Strangely enough, Kesha paid the entire bill. It all came to under 250 RMB, or yuan, in 1983. That would be slightly over US $100. And from the time he had arrived in Beijing to when he went back home to Changsha, barely over 8 weeks. So many events that had historical significance came about in that short duration. Okay. New woman, new life. Discharged from the hospital in the midst of a bitter, freezing Beijing winter had no effect on Kesha's frame of mind. Her arduous journey had survived numerous barriers, but her unwavering persistence to stay the course was her reward. A life of impersonating womanhood was over, for now she was prepared to go forth as a legitimate woman and not be denied of her new identity. A driver of one of her relatives transported Kesha to Uncle Wong's and Auntie Zhang Xi's house for some additional rest and recovery from her operations. Being a single story, it was a blessing not to have stairs to climb. The 5 days spent with her relatives were especially joyful for Kesha as they caught up on family news, not to mention the welcome home-cooked meals. Kesha's day of departure was coordinated with the arrival of the train on which her cousin, Xiao Yu, was also the daughter of Kesha's host these last few days, and she was on board. Xiao Wu was the official train announcer for departure and arrival information for onboard passengers and responsible for providing selected music to be played. Since Xiao Yu had her own small private compartment, it proved to be very comfortable for Kesha, having a bed to sleep on for the 24-hour journey to Changsha. As the train arrived at the Changsha station, Kesha's parents and all siblings were anxiously awaiting on the platform. The 10-minute stay at the station afforded Xiao Yu to join in with all the greetings. During that time, a friend of Kesha's brother walked by and asked what he was doing there. "I was waiting for the arrival of my sister," correcting himself with laughter. Kesha wasted no time to start the process of getting her records to be changed to reflect her new gender. Taking her paperwork from the Beijing hospital to the Changsha government was only the first step. Then, in a somewhat bureaucratic manner, the records were sent to the Guangzhou General Hospital, which in turn dispatched a representative Changsha to escort Kesha to the local Navy hospital for a physical examination. with the results relayed back to the Guangzhou General Hospital to change their records, and the Changsha government now satisfied with Kesha's correct gender, employment was finally at hand. Kesha was asked about her work preference, and she opted to select the Friendship Store, which was having its grand opening. This type of store was traditionally strictly for foreigners who exchanged their foreign currency to Chinese foreign exchange currency, of which was not allowed for Chinese citizens to possess. While quality of products was authentic, prices were not always a bargain. Selling Johnny Walker label, Red Label whiskey, and American cigarettes, Coca-Cola, and a host of other foreign products, they would not be found in regular Chinese stores. The official currency in China is the RMB, or renminbi, people's money, also referred to as yuan. Kesha made it a point to register her employment name to reflect her new gender. A slight change in the character altered it from the previous meaning of sand to flower, thus no mistaking her woman's status. What must have been attributed to widespread gossip, Kesha's new personality had preceded her, and the curiosity seekers outnumbered paying customers. It would take about a year before the onlookers realized that she did not originate from another planet. Just prior to her employment, Kesha got acquainted with a friend of her brother's, which he came to the Zhang family home, and instant chemistry set in, and Kesha had found a boyfriend. Chen knew from day one of Kesha's sexual orientation, but it was simply not an issue with him. They became inseparable, and getting from work to work was by Chen's motorcycle. Other times when work hours changed, Kesha would sleep in a dormitory located within the building. The relationship was a happy one for about a 4-month period, but it began to unravel when Kesha met his parents. They were actually very nice and friendly, and Kesha was a lunch and dinner guest at their home quite often. But the prospect of not realizing any grandchildren was most difficult for Chen's mother, and pressure was brought forth to avoid making any future marriage plans. With due respect for Chen's mother, Kesha reluctantly broke off the relationship, which was a bitter disappointment from Chen. During this time, Kesha had continued corresponding with Chiu Tak Chi, and she was forthright with him about her relationship with Chen. It didn't matter to Mr. Chiu, because he was patiently hoping to have their relationship advance to the next level. January 1984 found Kesha's parents once again in the Guangzhou Army Hospital with his annual winter treatments related to pneumonia. Kesha was granted a short leave from her work to join them, but not before informing Mr. Chiu of her arrival. Mr. Chiu left Hong Kong and arrived in Guangzhou to meet with Kesha, staying with his parents while Kesha was staying with her parents. It was a pleasant time to be together, and at the same time for all the important meeting of Kesha's parents. Dim sum, lunches and dinners along with movies, a walk in the park and various outings filled up Kesha's time. Mr. Chiu intimately brought up the subject of marriage, but Kesha insisted that she must first run it past her parents and family. A promise was made to gain a response as soon as possible. Business duties made it necessary for Mr. Chiu to return to Hong Kong, and Kesha stayed a little longer with her parents. Once she returned to her employment, it was not until April when the parents returned to Changsha. Almost immediately, the subject of marriage came up, and Kesha's brothers were united in making known their protest. They remembered the unpleasant past of the Cultural Revolution, when their lives were upended when they were forced to work in the countryside fields when it was known they had a Japanese auntie. And if there should be another cultural revolution, a marriage with a foreigner, being Hong Kong, could produce the same results. But when the parents gave their approval, the protests ceased. Kesha's father, however, laid down 3 stipulations that she must honor. 1. Age. Despite the difference in their ages, Kesha was not to change her mind as they both aged. 2. Sickness. This will become more apparent in old age, and he is not to be abandoned as a result. And 3, if his business should fail, that is not a reason to separate. Not to be left out, Kesha's mother gave her the approval of divorce if her husband should find another woman. Kesha's acceptance for all the conditions paved the way to proceed for the wedding plans. During the month of July, Kesha met up with her future husband in Guangzhou in preparation for their upcoming marriage. Kesha had actually made up her mind before getting permission from her family. Working at the friendship store was becoming unbearable, with the constant crowds of people wanting to see what she looked like. It took frequent unpaid leaves of absence to ultimately discourage the curious from finding her, for many of these people traveled many miles only to be disappointed when she was not in the store. Kesha was looking forward to a more private life in Hong Kong without people staring at her. When Ch2 and a few of his relatives arrived in Changsha days ahead of the September 14th marriage, the Zhang house had room for them all, and the visitors stayed for 2 weeks. Everyone was in a festive mood, and the days were filled with plenty of activities. Each and every morning was set aside to shop at the farmer's market, buying fresh vegetables and fish for most meals. One of Kesha's brothers had proven earlier in life that he was a good cook, and he prepared most of the meals for the gatherings. Much time was spent at home, getting acquainted with one another, watching TV, eating, and enjoying the rare occasions of beer and brandy. During some of the days, sightseeing and tours were made available by the general, who provided cars and drivers for those who wished to see the scenery of the picturesque China of Changsha countryside. When the day of the marriage took place, reservations were not required. Walk in and walk out in short order. The age requirement for a Chinese woman to get married was 23 years and 3 months, and Kesha did not quite meet that standard. But by marrying a foreigner, she was able to circumvent the rule. It was a simple, no-frills meeting at a government office only for couples that included a party of international status. Hong Kong at that time was a British Crown colony, and that was a resident of Mr. Chu. Everyone appeared in casual clothing, with a bride and groom each receiving a red paper with photos of each of them attached. That paper would have to be in each of their possession to show at any Chinese hotel if staying in the same room. Upon leaving the office, no reception was to follow, and any honeymoon would have to be delayed. It was time for Ch2 to return to Hong Kong, and his relatives made their way to Guangzhou, but all left on a happy note. In the meantime, Kesha wasted no time applying for her visa as Hong Kong loomed in her future. With application made now, it would be 3 years to September 1987 before it would be granted. By early 1985, it was obvious that the general's health was failing at an accelerated rate, mostly due to his ongoing pneumonia issues. Normally at the time of the year, he and his wife would be in Guangzhou to escape the harsh winters of Changsha, but a simple travel to get there would be an ordeal. For the year, the general would be treated for all medical issues from the Changsha Army Hospital. His doctors, however, strongly urged him to change his residence to Guangzhou with expectations that the milder climate would be more beneficial for his health. General Zhang was convinced that that was the correct formula to proceed with, but approval would have to come from the Beijing military authorities. He prepared a report of his medical problems, and the general's doctor did the same. Kesha was given the duty to proceed with the 2 reports to Beijing after the Chinese New Year celebrations concluded. She was to stay for 2 weeks with a family of a retired Navy admiral who was a friend of her father. The admiral escorted Kesha to the office of China's vice premier the following day, where Kesha delivered the 2 health reports. It would take time for the approval to be granted by the Beijing Army District, and in the meantime, Kesha had the pleasure to be with the admiral's daughter, who showed her many of Beijing's sights. Once Kesha returned to Changsha, The approval was soon granted, and funds were transferred to Guangzhou to have a residence built or one purchased for the general. But even as summer approached, health issues denied the general from going to Guangzhou, being treated often in the Army Hospital of Changsha. The separation and distance between Hong Kong and Changsha was not an imposing obstacle preventing the newlyweds from getting together whenever they desired. Kesha took the opportunity to reduce her working hours at the friendship store by taking frequent leaves. When she wasn't working, she obviously was not being paid. This was not a problem since Mr. Chu was now seeing to her financial needs. Whenever it was convenient, they would rendezvous in selected areas of interest such as Guilin, a most beautiful city in southern China with its famous pointed limestone peaks and caverns. Visits to Beijing were a must to take in everything the capital had to offer, but both were very fond of Guangzhou, and most reunions were in that area, being in close proximity to Hong Kong. The generosity of Mr. Chu never wavered, giving Kesha much desired items for her father when she returned to Changsha. Typical of most marriages, when a quarrel may erupt, consequences do vary. With Kesha, such a time did surface in June 1985, and she opted to do some traveling. Luckily, she was fortified with sufficient funds to see her cousin in Kunming and Yunnan province, taking a bus to Nanning, the capital of Guangxi province, then another bus to her destination. Changsha visited for a week. Knowing that she would be locating in different areas of her travels, Kesha made it a point to send postcards often to keep her family and husband posted. And whenever prompted her to select certain destinations, most were not pre-planned. After a visit in Kunming, Kesha set out to see Myanmar, which is Burma. Next stop, Chengdu, was to be the staging point for Tibet, but flooding became an issue and another route had to be taken. From Xining province, the only way to Tibet was to buy a ticket by truck, a grueling 4-day, 4-night trip. Apparently it was well worth it, for Kesha found Tibet and its countryside enchanting and remained there for a month. Upon leaving Tibet for Dunhuang, Gansu province, Kesha found herself in Xinjiang province and famous Silk Road. Being a very expansive area and for unlimited sightseeing, Kesha remained there for 2 months. Needless to say, her family members were very concerned for her safety and sent a telegram on September 30th to inform her that her father was in the hospital and come home quickly. The message couldn't have come at a worse time. With the arrival of China's national holiday, October 1, transportation means were stretched beyond limits, and Kesha was desperate to get home. She didn't hesitate to reach out to local political offices and mention that her father, retired general, was in the hospital and she needed an airline ticket immediately. Needing to verify her claim, it was in fact confirmed that her father was who she said he was. Given a letter from the mayor's office, Kesha took it to the airport and was soon flying home with stops in Xi'an and Wuhan. When Kesha finally arrived in Changsha, her absence from start to finish was 4 months. It was a sweet homecoming with even her worried husband there, but the nicest surprise was that her father was home and had not been in the hospital. It took a little trickery to have Kesha expedite her journey home. Life was back to normal, and Chu Tak-chi was to stay 10 more days with the Zhang family before having to head back to Hong Kong. Days continued to be repetitive, and early morning shopping at the farmer's market, local sightseeing by car, and dining and visiting with one and all. It was a lifestyle they all relished. The 3-year wait for Kesha's Hong Kong visa did allow her one visit there before 1987, but the time was at the discretion of the Chinese government. She got her notice to be in Hong Kong in early January 1986, and for her allotted time, Kesha intended to make the most of it. Arrival in Hong Kong. Her arrival in Hong Kong on January 1986 proved to be a totally different environment than what Kesha was familiar. Settling in home of her husband, Ch2, it was time to get acquainted with his relatives and socialize. Days were also filled with shopping and sightseeing and sampling dim sum, better known as yamcha in that region, which she first experienced in Guangzhou and became an indulgence. The sights that most impressed her were Ocean Park, the Peak, Changsha Island, and its popular seafood, and the bargain shopping of Lady Street Market. The daily good times, however, were interrupted when Kesha received an alarming telegram early morning of February 12. Calling home immediately, she was informed that her father was near death and to come immediately. Making arrangements to take the train the next day from Changsha, Kesha set out to do a little shopping for the family that afternoon. The train didn't arrive in Changsha until the 14th, where a brother drove her to the hospital immediately and informed Kasha on the way that her father apparently had passed away later in the day of the 12th, but miraculously recovered hours earlier. Kesha was united with a distressed mother in the room with her father still clinging to life. Initially on the 12th, Kesha's mother related that the general was declared to have died since the doctors failed to find any vital signs of life. He was not breathing, had no pulse, and his wife continued to hold his cold hand, sobbing uncontrollably. The request earlier by the hospital to remove the general's body was abruptly denied until the local family members were there. In the meantime, all the windows were opened and the heat turned off. Furthermore, Kesha's mother insisted that the general's uniforms must be delivered by the East Lake Army District Management. But 2 hours later, grief turned to elation when the general suddenly revived and related to his wife that he had been taken to a very cold and dark place and that a heavy wind blew him back to life. The windows were then immediately closed. Kesha was to spend the next 7 nights with her father, and the first 2 were very joyous. She helped feed him, and he had a good appetite at that time, but he continued to fail the following days until he ultimately died at noon on the 21st of February. During the first week of March, the hospital hearse transported his casket to a funeral hall, which included a large number of vehicles, many of which were police escorts, to monitor traffic to the destination. Kesha and the family members were in the second vehicle behind the hearse. The funeral hall was packed to capacity, and another large group was forced to remain outside the cold weather, hoping to gain entrance at some point. With some short eulogies, those in attendance passed by the open casket to pay their final respects. The procession to the funeral hall, shown on the 7 o'clock news, illustrated the importance of the deceased. Once Kesha and the family members were transported back home, the general's faithful driver drove back to the hall to retrieve the remains and deliver them to the family and enjoying them with a meal. For the next 14 years, the general's widow would keep the remains in her bedroom. Kesha's husband, after spending another week or so in Changsha, returned to Hong Kong after the funeral. The plan to have the general and his wife establish their new residence in Guangzhou was now abandoned. But while the widow, Zolin, was still authorized to make the move, it became apparent that only one other member of her family would be permitted to live with her. No way would she leave the other 6 behind, so now the residency plans were back to square one. But good fortune smiled on Zolin from an unexpected source. Her son-in-law was informed that another general's widow was interested in living in Guangzhou, and perhaps a trade could be made. Ultimately, it was done with the approval of the Guangzhou Army District, and the Zhang family would be able to obtain the same living space in a building near the downtown area of Changsha that the other widow would receive in Guangzhou. As of June 1986, the Zhangs moved in to get acquainted with their new environment and found that there was sufficient room for those that elected to live there. Solin would call this home until 1993. Life was pretty much back to normal, with Kesha continuing her work at the Friendship store, but by a self-imposed part-time status. She and Chiu Tak-chi would continue to get together as often as possible, and their meetings were mostly in Guangzhou and Changsha, which was convenient for both. Life was uneventful, but pleasant for the rest of the year and well into 1987. Kesha's normal routines were to work minimally at the Friendship store, and when not spending time with her husband, life with her mother and available siblings presented much joy for all concerned. Satisfaction in their new home was well received from the beginning. Kesha was well aware that her 3-year wait to receive her visa to move to Hong Kong was at hand, and when late September arrived, she was informed to go to a government office to pick up the approved visa. By the following month, Kesha found herself once again in Hong Kong, but this time on a permanent basis. Life was to continue as before with her husband, and since she was already well acquainted with his relatives, the previous routines of the past were well entrenched. Sightseeing of areas not seen before, daily dim sum, and always a lot of shopping. Chiu Tak-chi's elder sister took control of Kesha and spared no expense in buying her clothing and many other gifts. Spare time was plentiful since Kesha's husband did not wish for her to work, and that was only to last for about 6 months. Kesha wanted to be involved with a more active lifestyle. A newspaper article caught Kesha's attention, and with the blessings of her husband, she enrolled for training at a modeling school. For the next 2 or 3 months, she learned the fine arts of applying makeup, proper dressing, and striding along a catwalk to display a number of fashions. Once the classes concluded for the day, Kesha and some of her other modeling students would find relaxation to socialize at a restaurant. But this routine soon changed to going to a nightclub to be paid by the establishment to sit, talk, and dance occasionally with men patrons who would buy them drinks. This nightclub portion was kept secret from her husband. Kesha was very popular at that setting, but trouble loomed ahead. Pressure was applied by determined patrons to take this relationship to the next level, and sexual advancements were denied several times. Deciding that the situation was spiraling out of control, Kesha quit this routine for her own safety and pondered her next move. Kesha asked her husband for employment, and with his approval, she landed a job promoting Carlsberg beer through an advertisement in a newspaper. Kesha was to wear an evening dress at each restaurant location throughout Hong Kong, and this job was to last for about a year. While still in this employ, Kesha became concerned for the needed long-term health protection, which was deemed important. Unfortunately, her husband, Chiu Tak-chi, took an opposing viewpoint for himself, thinking, being a picture of good health, that he would remain in that condition. Time would prove him wrong. In August 1989, Kesha made a purchase of a policy with an AIA insurance and elected to pay for it the following day. The weather was near its deadliest worst. A typhoon hit Hong Kong at a Category 8, but Kesha refused to deliver her check another day. Braving the dangerous elements, she met the agent at the Mong Kok MTR station so that her policy would be immediately in effect. The agent was very impressed with Kesha's determination and offered her a job with the company, which she accepted. Beginning December 1989, she would be an agent with AIA for 1 year. The next month, Kesha had the opportunity to perform in a fashion show at the Miramar Hotel and was recognized by a young woman who remembered seeing her at the Changsha Friendship store where so many people congregated, hoping to see China's first transgender. That meeting seemed innocent enough at the outset, but soon it developed into one of Kesha's worst nightmares. Perhaps by that woman's accurate assumption, she surmised that Kesha's husband as well as her employers, knew nothing of her sex change and began to put in motion an elaborate blackmail scheme to make Kesha's life a living hell. Kesha had unwittingly given her pager number since this relationship appeared to be non-threatening, but by asking for a small amount of borrowed money at the outset, the amounts increased with an emergency need every time. The third time, Kesha was confronted by the woman along with a man. During all these encounters, Kesha's residence was known, and when she left for work in the morning, they would be waiting nearby to follow her to work. A fourth encounter around the Christmas season, it was apparent that Kesha was being financially drained, and she informed that enough is enough. Kesha quit work and remained home for a couple of months by hoping it would be ended. But Kesha had become a cash cow to those low-lifers, and it would not end so easy. Kesha had developed a reputation of being a top insurance agent at AIA, earning the prestigious $1 Million Round Table Award, and didn't go unnoticed by competing companies. During the early springtime after Chinese New Year in 1991, the New York Life Insurance Company conducted a recruiting party at the home of their general manager in Ch4 The New Territories. As one of the invitees, a newly refurbished office in Chimcha for the company was too tempting to resist. Hoping for a fresh start from her past trouble, Kesha was hired as an agent and wasted no time excelling in sales. In 3 months' time, she became sales manager, but fate dealt her another losing hand, for the blackmailers had followed her to her new employment. Having previously assured Kesha that no more payments would be needed, it was just another lie. That summer they demanded more money than Kesha had, so she gave up her gold jewelry, diamond ring, and her Rolex watch. Realizing that continued employment at New York Life would be disastrous, Kesha reluctantly called it quits, forcing to give up a very promising career. Desperate to escape the clutches of that criminal element, Kesha made contact with her Japanese cousin by deciding to go to that country. She was encouraged to take some Japanese language lessons, which she did for 2 months, and apply for a visa to make her way to Japan. In the meantime, Kesha performed in another of her numerous fashion shows, this time at the Sheraton Hotel. Attending was the popular kung fu artist and movie director Carter Wong. He took note of Kesha's short hairstyle and offered her the opportunity to take part in one of his movies. Following tradition, kung fu students were required to pay for 2 tables at a banquet, and Kesha did just that. Of course, taking part in a kung fu movie did require some talent, and she proceeded to take kung fu lessons. But accidents happened, and doing a kung fu move, Kesha broke her ankle. She spent 2 weeks in the hospital for treatment and had to wear a walking cast, and spent the next 2 months at home recuperating. Needless to say, Kesha was to have no role in Carter Wong's movie. But during her short stint at kung fu training, Kesha hit it off with a younger man trainee and established a relationship was to last for about a year. Thinking he would be possible protecting to end the blackmailing scheme that would not go away, Kesha found herself in an unexpected dilemma. The man fell in love with her. There was no way the truth could be revealed now about the transgender status of Kesha, but the relationship continued to go forward with dating and taking intermittent trips, even including a short trip to the Silk Road, one of Kesha's favorite destinations. The problem continued with the blackmailers following them even to his residence, and that to his parents. And without his presence from time to time, Kesha was still coerced to making more payments. Hopeful that a friendship with another kung fu training would be successful, fate once again was most unkind. Kesha saw on the early morning TV news that he was killed in a traffic accident. Stress and desperation simply overwhelmed Kesha, and finally told her boyfriend that she was moving to Taiwan. It was a bitter disappointment for him, thinking that he was being dumped. Kesha had no way to tell him the truth. Exiting Hong Kong for Taiwan would be bittersweet for Kesha, but it would prove to be her best option to end her agony of paying hush money to protect her gender status. To date, Kesha's husband had no clue, as well as her former employer. Depression had taken its toll on her, and she simply felt it necessary to find a new life and start over. Despite her movements to return to Hong Kong every few months in the future, the evildoer were never seen again. But having lost an approximate amount of $50,000 over the years, Kesha's secret was priceless. If her husband was concerned about her comings and going lifestyle, he didn't question it. Knowing that Kesha had to make a living and plan for her future, Chiu Tak-chi continued to support her lifestyle, although he had sold his businesses and was to remain home most of the time. Escape to Taiwan. By early 1994, Kesha made her way to the southern port city of Kaohsiung, Taiwan, and had previously arranged to stay with a long-time lady friend. Almost immediately, she found employment in a nightclub, and for the next 6 months proved to be very popular with the patrons, who were happy to buy drinks and listen to her adventures in mainland China, knowing that was her home country. At that time, travel between mainland China and Taiwan was not in place, and they were eager to learn about the Silk Road and the famous tourist areas in which Changsha knew very well. Singing karaoke was also a popular pastime with her, and she did some dancing. Life was good, but a patron encouraged Kesha that a more productive life could be had in the restaurant business, and for the next number of years, she engaged herself with several of them. Ultimately, she settled in with a private home cuisine restaurant and was to become a part owner until 2003. Kesha became good friends with a customer, a lady nurse, socializing locally from time to time. The nurse made a decision to enter into a Kaohsiung beauty contest and encouraged Kesha to accompany her for the sign-up. Named after the official flower of Kaohsiung, known as the red silk cotton tree, the pageant attracted many contestants, and upon arriving at the sign-up, Kesha caught the attention of some of the officials and was persuaded to sign up also. Once the competition began, the field of contestants was reduced to 22 from 32 and ultimately to 15. Kesha survived the cut to make it to one of the finalists, and soon they were rewarded with a 3-night goodwill tour to the Philippines, wholly financed by a very rich businessman. After staying in Subic Bay for the duration, Kesha made her way to Manila to catch a flight to Hong Kong to visit her husband. Soon after, she received a phone call from her nurse friend, who had arrived in Hong Kong along with 2 other contestants and 3 men, one being the previously mentioned rich man, the Attorney General of Kaohsiung, and the other one connected with the pageant. While on the phone, one of the other 2 women alerted the men in their hotel room that Kesha was on the other end of the line, and in a rage, that phone call was terminated. Kesha's friend was hoping to have her take the 3 women on a shopping tour to Lady Street Market, but the men, who were all married, saw to it that they were confined to their hotel rooms and they were to have no further contact with Kesha. After 3 days, those 6 people returned to Kaohsiung, and Kesha returned 2 weeks later. And upon returning, it was a shock to learn from a contestant friend that Kesha was disqualified from the contest for lying about her age. The next day, Kesha was confronted by a man who warned her not to talk about anything about this matter. A few days later, she was contacted by a newspaper reporter asking, in fact, that she cheated. Kesha went on to explain that the pageant officials had copies of her required documents, including visa, that clearly revealed her age, which they accepted. Once the truth was published in the newspaper and then in a magazine with Kesha's picture, she was confronted again with a more menacing face-to-face threat to maintain her silence if she didn't want to end up in the ocean where her body would not be found. Back at the private home cuisine, Kesha had to make plans for her personal safety. 2 days later, a group of men arrived for lunch, and one of them was a long-time good customer that had tried to get Kesha's attention often. She had always been good terms with them, but now Kesha needed to score a better relationship. She knew he was a gun runner who bought contraband arms and munitions from the Philippines and sneaked them into Taiwan. Certainly not a man to have as an enemy, but by forging a closer relationship, Kesha's safety was sealed when they discussed the issue privately in the parking lot. That night at a nightclub, the man made it known in the presence of a large crowd that Kesha was his girlfriend, and she was assured of being well protected. Kesha, however, had to get used to not living in one apartment for an extended period. Being a wanted man by the police, they changed residences every few months, trying to play it safe to avoid being found by the authorities. For the next year and a half, Kesha experienced peace of mind and had no hint of trouble. But trouble and Kesha were not strangers, and while her boyfriend was visiting a friend, he found himself suddenly arrested. Despite now being in custody, Kesha's boyfriend's followers continued to assure her that her safety would not be compromised. Making immediate contact at the city jail, Kesha's boyfriend asked for one of his favorite foods, chicken scallop soup. Kesha asked the jail authority if she would be allowed to cook this in the jail building, giving assurance that she would provide sufficient for the 10 officers as well. No problem, for a home-cooked meal would be most welcome. A side reward was that the 2 hours of food preparation allowed Kesha and the boyfriend more time to visit. The city jail, however, was temporary, and he was transferred to another facility in Tatong. Kesha was now required to obtain a monthly visitation permit from a legislative office, and for about a year and a half, she would continue her visitations. In February 2002, Kesha was compelled to write him a letter explaining that she had to return to Guangzhou to be with her dying husband. But her rapid trip to see him was not in time, Chiu Tak Chi having passed away 3 hours earlier. After his funeral a few days later, Kesha proceeded to return to Changsha to be with her mother for the next 2 months. But Kesha knew she had to return to Kaohsiung to prepare to do her best to revive the restaurant business, which was failing due to her various absences. Still struggling with after 3 months, Kesha received a call from a brother to return to Changsha since her mother was now in a hospital and not expected to last much longer. Upon arrival, Kesha received the same prognosis from the doctor and made it a point to stay with her mother for about a month, whose life was at low ebb. It was difficult for Kesha to watch as her mother began to slip away, complaining not being able to breathe and asking for a pillow. She already had 2 pillows and slowly drew her last breath, a victim of heart failure. The funeral was held a week later, and her remains were ultimately placed next to her husband's at the top level of the Martyrs' Tower in Changsha, a place of honor. It must be noted that Zhu Lin was a martyr in her own right, since she joined the army in 1944 in the fight against the Japanese. Kesha stayed in the family home for about 2 months and left for Kaohsiung for a final time. The restaurant business continued to worsen, but she stayed there for 3 months hoping for better results. Despite all organized efforts, the business failed, and Kesha found it necessary to return to Changsha in April 2003. She would remain there until the summer of 2004 with an ambitious plan to tell one and all who she really is. A note: the full coming out details of Kesha's identification are found in the last chapter of this book, The Story Behind the Story, revealing Kesha's true identity. It was best to divulge this in chronological order to maintain continuity, since the revelations occurred over a period of years. The story behind this story, revealing Kesha's true identity. Despite Kesha's lifelong dream to attain true womanhood, his quest for that goal was marred with a number of obstacles along the way. Nevertheless, his persistence won out in 1983, and with a safe and successful sex change operation, and now her life could embody some peace of mind. Knowing that Kesha's first 20 years were filled with turmoil and uncertainty, she certainly was not expecting her next 20 years to be so challenging. But the need to keep her new status private began to unravel immediately after her operation. The hospital staff did its best to treat Kesha as an ordinary patient, but her recovery time post-operation apparently drew the attention of some of the sports-related patients in the adjacent wards. They would come to visit her on a few occasions and bring snack items. The nurses were really kept busy chasing them away as much as possible, and how they knew of Kesha's operation remained a mystery. Not long after her recovery from home, Kesha got the job she asked for, working at the new Friendship store in Changsha. A number of employees were also from the same East Lake neighborhood where Kesha's family home was located, and growing up together, there was no secrets of her new status. And with all her personal records in the administrative office of the store, it would be possible that they would be viewed and discussed with others. Almost immediately after Kesha began her work as a salesperson, the store grew daily crowds, but they didn't come to shop. It was all about Kesha. She had become a cause celebrity, and it would be difficult to understand what they expected to see. Still, Kesha found it necessary to reduce her work days to avoid much of this unwanted attention. Once Kesha was married and moved to Hong Kong, she could not imagine one of her worst nightmares was about to surface. Being recognized by a young woman who remembered Kesha working at the Changsha department store, a lucrative blackmail scheme was about to be launched. That woman, and ultimately her boyfriend, accurately assumed that Kesha was keeping her sex secret change from her husband and employees and proceeded to squeeze her financially. Earlier, the woman expressed a friendly manner and had convinced Kesha to give her pager number for future communications. Thus began a change of Kesha's state of mind. A desperation set in almost due to having them follow her wherever she went. They knew where she lived and her employers, and no way to avoid them. Payments were demanded each time, and a desperate situation to avoid any future contact soon forced Kesha to leave the area. After much deliberation, she thought Taiwan would be a better destination. Kesha's state of desperation deepened when she returned to Taiwan after visiting her husband in Hong Kong. Learning from another pageant contestant that she had been disqualified over the issue of her age, the news media picked up on her controversy and interviewed Kesha on her side. It didn't take long for a major threat against her life to push Kesha into seeking help from her protective boyfriend. That state of depression was obviously elevated, preventing her from sleeping, and he suggested that she see a psychiatrist. For the first time, the truth was openly divulged about her sex change, but Kesha knew that the confidentiality between the doctor and patient would prevent her secret from leaking out. But this man was really caught off guard, having a difficult time believing that he was actually dealing with a transgender for the first time. He made a point to study her face carefully and took hold of Kesha's hand to gently caress it to be convinced that he saw no manly traits. Kesha was suggested not to keep her status pent up, but to be open about it for her own peace of mind. The psychiatrist encouraged her to write a book about who she is, or to be interviewed by various sources of the media. These approaches would help release her anxieties so she could lead a normal life. Kesha took the psychiatrist's advice seriously, and upon her next visit to see her mother, she took a month in 1998 to write her life story, Woman's Dream. To keep it a secret from her husband, Kesha had to delay making plans for its distribution until a later time. Later in 2002, when Kesha was in Taiwan dealing with a failing restaurant, Kesha had to return to Changsha when her mother was in the hospital and not expected to last much longer. Kesha stayed in her room for the month-plus duration, seeing to her mother's needs and comfort. It was during this time when phone calls began coming to Kesha's relatives from TV channels interested in making a documentary of Kesha's life. All of Kesha's previous trips to Changsha to visit her mother were always done in secrecy. This time, however, it became public since it was known that Kesha was seeking a writer to supplement her previous book, Woman's Dream, and to get it published. Widespread gossip could only be the source to learn of Kesha's plans. The calls from the media sources were mostly ignored, but when one came from Sun TV, Kesha's mother took an interest since she respected its CEO, Yang Yan, for her appearances on TV. Kesha made the decision to have Sun TV to create the documentary, but the week-long project didn't get completed before Kesha's mother passed away. But at the same time, while Kesha was staying with her mother in the hospital, she made the choice of selecting a writer to enhance her book, turning over all the material to him to ultimately get it published as soon as possible. Soon after her mother's funeral, Kesha prepared to make her final trip back to Taiwan, hoping to do whatever was necessary to keep the restaurant in business. After 3 months, however, the effort proved futile, and final preparations were made to return to Changsha. Once back home, Kesha was to find that her book was published and the book signings were soon to take place. From June 2003, Kesha then embarked on journeys from one province to another with the other writer, all the while the local news media making it known about her unique person. Kesha's extensive travels were well covered on TV, and it soon caught the attention of her late husband's sister in Hong Kong. Not the least bit happy with all the publicity being generated, the lady wanted to know if Kesha was doing this for money, and if she needed financial assistance, return to Hong Kong. Kesha said money was not the issue, so the book signings that went on for almost a year came to an abrupt halt. Kesha made her way back to Hong Kong in total secrecy. Without her availability, no more books were to be printed. Respecting Chinese tradition, Kesha knew she had the obligation of being with her late husband's family for 3 years without remarrying. That is why she stayed in Hong Kong until 2005. California, here I come. At the strong request of her late husband's sister, Kesha made her way back to Hong Kong and settled into the apartment for the two of them. Kesha would remain there for a year and a half while she pondered her next move, wanting a fresh start in a new destination. With her own bedroom and a computer, she made a connection with a matchmaking service to seek out a soulmate in a country that would be desirable. A few years earlier would be a reminder for what her mother recommended. If you move to another country to find your happiness, Northern Europe, especially Scandinavia, would be a worthy choice. With a stunning picture of herself to show men who were also looking for a mate, Kesha was overwhelmed with numerous suitors from all walks of life. They were all anxious to arrive in Hong Kong to make an impression, and they did just that. Despite professional titles and apparent financial means, Kesha was more impressed with the qualities of the sixth and final candidate who arrived in Hong Kong from California. With a face-to-face meeting in February 2005, Kesha was assured that he had 3 qualities that convinced her the search was over. Learning that the American's major ancestry was Norwegian to go along with her mother's wishes, that he was a retired law enforcement officer, and that he visited his mother each night on his way home from work, Kesha would look forward to having her new life in the Golden State. And Kesha was especially grateful, knowing that she would be inheriting a mother-in-law for about 17 months, who she would ultimately adore. The winning suitor, Bruce Eastley, proceeded back to his home in Sacramento, California, and began the arduous task of dealing with the necessary immigration forms, hoping to expedite Kesha's arrival as soon as possible. Not expecting any miracle of approval in 2005, Bruce planned a trip to one of his favorite and frequent destinations in Asia, the paradise island of Bali, where they would meet. Kesha, who would now be known as Changsha, would have to fly from Hong Kong, and during the month of June, she would see that Bruce would arrive with a number of friends. Thanks to a hotel friend he previously met on past trips, Ray Clark was the general manager of the Nusa Dua Beach Resort at the time he arranged a memorable wedding ceremony and dinner at beachside for Bruce and Changsha and his guests. Complete with live music, the setting was idyllic, and Changsha was convinced that Bali was indeed worthy of additional visits in the future. The wedding itself was not officially registered so as not to interfere with the immigration paperwork already filed back home. The date of June 12, 2005 would continue to be celebrated as a wedding date, along with the official one to follow soon. Looking forward to Changsha's hopeful arrival soon, it came about in November, and plans were made for an immediate official wedding that occurred on December 10th in their house. It would be officiated by Judge Renard Shepard, who was present with a group in Bali. The judge and Bruce both worked at the county courthouse, where Bruce was a courtroom bailiff, first as a deputy marshal and as a deputy sheriff when the two departments merged. Getting settled into her new home, Changsha made it necessary to get acquainted with her new mother-in-law, Esther, as soon as possible. Esther lived alone in her own apartment, and Bruce's dad, Einar, a career army man, died in 1960, with his mother being widowed all those years. Having been married previously and his wife leaving him, Bruce's mother was skeptical of this union and rebuffed Changsha's earlier attempts to create a warm relationship. Visit number 1 was an icy one-smile silence. Visit number 2 wasn't much better, but perhaps Esther was surprised that Changsha was so persistent to bond. Visit number 3 showed some progress, and number 4 was the beginning of a positive and happy chats. Changsha's henceforth arrived to greet her with a warm hug, and it wasn't unusual to see them both laughing together much of the time by spending hours watching some of Esther's favorite programs. Changsha admitted that she was to learn some of her English terminology by repeated viewings of the Jerry Springer Show, the Maury Povich Show, Gunsmoke, Bonanza, and because Esther loved watching Gone with the Wind non-stop, Changsha had to watch it at least twice. The year 2006 did not go completely as planned. Reservations were made for a return trip to Bali, but the delay in getting Changsha's green card was not anticipated. Without it, she was grounded. Time had elapsed to cancel a journey, and monies were not refundable. Bruce had no choice but to go with friends and leave Changsha behind. But this scenario played out much better than expected. For the short duration, Changsha would be spending much more time with her mother-in-law, and that suited them both fine. At some point, when Changsha visited Esther in her apartment, she overheard her talking to a longtime friend. If there were any doubts about the feelings her mother-in-law felt towards Changsha, it was dispelled then and there. God took my Barbara, but gave me Shashi. Daughter Barbara died of a malignant brain tumor in 2002, and Esther lovingly called her daughter-in-law Shashi. Changsha continued her dedicated attentions to her mother-in-law in 2007, insisting, among other deeds, to be her manicurist as well as her podiatrist and painting her nails at least once every month. Daily visits were eager events, but an unforeseen health issue took Esther by surprise. What apparently was a bad case of pneumonia, a visit to her doctor confirmed it. Esther was immediately admitted to a hospital and would be there under strict care for 4 days and 3 nights. Changsha was not about to be separated, and for 3 nights she slept in a chair in Esther's room to be of any kind of assistance. Unfortunately, Esther was discharged and arrangements were made for her to continue her recovery in a nursing facility. Again, Changsha saw to it that she would be visiting her daily, but recovery progress was not being made. While a patient at the facility, Esther's 98th birthday on May 21st was planned and carried out with a cake and candles while bedridden. But in just 1 week later, in the presence of Bruce and Changsha, as well as her 2 granddaughters, Jennifer and Jessica, Esther drew her last breath after a prolonged sleep. The day before, Esther asked Changsha to bring the wedding ring Einar had given her years ago. But on that fateful day, Esther was already asleep. Changsha was not about to see her taken away until she was attired in a new pink nightgown and her fingernails had been painted the day before. Ultimately, her cremains would be placed with her husband, Einar's, gravesite in the National Cemetery at the Presidio of San Francisco. Life would proceed in a routine, if not mundane manner for the most part for the coming years, but that was by design. Still, Changsha was anxious to get involved in some humanitarian type of service, and both she and Bruce agreed. For a number of years, Bruce was a regular customer at the Yagi barbershop, where both Hiko and Alice Yagi were plying their trade. Hiko would often gently prod Bruce to join the Lions Club, and being invited to be a guest speaker, it seemed to be a good fit. The Senator Lions Club was originally chartered with Americans of Japanese descent in 1954, and it was the home of Kei Fukushima, Lions Club International President of 2002 to 2003. LCI was founded in 1916 by Dr. William Perry Woods of Evansville, Indiana, and today the membership in at least 210 countries and territories has been estimated to be about 1.4 million members. It was most fitting to have Hiko sponsor Bruce and Alice for Changsha when they joined in 2008. Serving the community by funding various needs proved to be very satisfying, and fundraising events were always fun to work with and large groups of volunteers. Staying dedicated to the Lions motto, "We serve," Changsha was alerted to a serious problem confronted with the Sacramento Capital Lions Club in 2016 while attending one of their meetings. Having been chartered in 1953 for Americans of Chinese descent, it was in danger of being disbanded as its membership was well below the allowable limit. Changsha was able to rally 9 Chinese friends to join Capital Lions, and the club received their new lease of life. This caught the attention of the current district governor, Kumar Kalagara, and he suggested that Changsha should form her own club. Changsha insisted that she was unable to do that, so the district governor then approached Bruce to get his opinion of the matter. Bruce was very convinced that Changsha was most capable of doing just that, since she was well respected in the Chinese community and had a good rapport with many of their associations. Before the year ended, Changsha had her required 25 prospective members available, with District 4C5 giving its approval, and in less than a month, Lions Club International made it official. Because Changsha was the only one of the 25 with Lions experience, she was to be the charter president of Camellia Lions. Later in 2022, Changsha would again be their president. All members of this club are women. With a new club to receive its charter in 2017, a name had yet to be designated. Bruce suggested Camellia, since Sacramento in past years was known as the Camellia Capital of America. The name became official, and the past district governor Irv Gahn of the Embarcadero Lions Club and past president Dave Pevney of the Capital Lions Club became Camellia's guiding lions to help the club to maintain a smooth process of activities. A club pin was also needed, and past district governor Cat Gahn, also of Embarcadero, was to design one to their liking. As a result, Camellia Lions bestowed past district governor Cat with an associate membership of the Camellia Lions Club. In such a short notice, Changsha has made her presence known with Lionism and has been recognized for her active roles. The highest award in the organization is the Melvin Jones Fellow, which she received along with others such as an appreciation award in recognition of her exceptional accomplishment. But Changsha has never forgotten her roots, being very active to assist Senator Lyons with her fundraising whenever and wherever. With her connections, she sells more banquet tables than anyone else. In return, Bruce remains active for Camellia, having recently written the lyrics for the new Camellia Club song. To date, Changsha has attended the 2017 Lions Club International Convention in Chicago and a number of the district conventions of the 50-plus Lions Clubs in District 4C5. Camellia Lions is certainly one of the more active clubs. The ladies work very well together, and they have fun achieving their goals, many of which exceed their expectations. Shocking revelation. When Kesha made the fateful decision to have Sun TV of Beijing to do the documentary of her life, it was accomplished in 1 week. For the first time, Kesha's real identity was purposely on display, and she knew there would be no turning back. Unfortunately, to this day, she has no knowledge how much exposure was generated by its release. But regardless of the extent of the viewing audience, would people still remember from 2002? One has to wonder if that documentary was still being shown at any time, or simply shelved or perhaps destroyed for lack of interest. The interest came in 2019, and it took a lot of people by surprise. Changsha was in Honolulu on a solo trip to visit her godmother, Dolly Louie, on her 80th birthday. During her time there, she received a phone call from a friend, Lily Quan, of the Chinese publication World Journal. Lily related that a large number of Chinese women informed her that Changsha, or formerly Kesha's, documentary had found its way onto YouTube, and was she aware of it? It seemed that Changsha was the last to find out, and now she had decisions to make upon before returning back to Sacramento. Before leaving Honolulu, however, Changsha had to quickly improvise a plan of survival in a new environment if it became necessary. She found a condo in a convenient location, and the job situation would be resolved working in a hotel or a gift shop. She simply wanted to cover all the bases if the worst-case scenario played out, and was satisfied that Honolulu was the viable solution. With all the problems the former Kesha had faced in her earlier life, being on the run from one area to another had become the norm. It was never pleasant, but she felt it was necessary to do her best to avert being discovered of her true identity and to avoid various unrelated dangers. Even with a low-key lifestyle in her apparently safe environment of Sacramento, it was always in the back of Changsha's mind that someday she would have to run again. The following day upon arrival, Changsha got together with Lily Quan and discussed over lunch the situations that the video on the YouTube brought forth. With a link Lily had received, many of her readers were glued to Changsha's old video and were interested in learning more. Would she be interested in doing some interviews? Changsha rejected that outright. She had to ponder what possible problems may have to be created and what remedies were best to apply. Changsha's anxieties were briefly set aside by taking a previously planned Holland America cruise around Japan with her husband Bruce. Always maximizing the use of her iPhone, Changsha realized that a large house she had admired for years was on the market. Immediately she set out with a WeChat message to her real estate friend to somehow put it on hold until she returned from the cruise. Bruce was not made aware of this until they returned home. Really preferring to downsize and not going in the other direction, Bruce agreed that this custom-made home, built by a contractor for he and his wife, had too many bells and whistles to say no. They moved in by October 2019. The following year of 2020 that introduced COVID-19 to the world kept people from moving about if they valued their lives. This escalated to high numbers, and whatever Changsha planned to do next concerning her identity issues were simply placed on hold. While the dangers of the COVID virus were still very serious in 2021, activities did take place in the patio of their new home. Changsha conducted a board meeting of her Camellia Lions Club to discuss confidential issues out of the presence of Bruce. Changsha's entire club was well aware of Changsha's secret identity, but emergency measures had to be discussed since Bruce remained uninformed. Changsha made it known that Jenny Fong, the Camellia Lions Club charter vice president, would be in charge of the club and work with the members to keep it going if Changsha had to relocate to Honolulu in the event of Bruce divorcing her. Changsha received solid assurances from the members that they would faithfully abide by her wishes, but at the same time telling Changsha that they highly doubted Bruce would opt for a divorce once he knew. Only two issues worried Changsha: being criticized and rejected by the Chinese community and being divorced. Simply one of the two would be sufficient to force Changsha to head for Honolulu. It didn't make long before Changsha realized the Chinese community accepted her without any negativity, and no one even discussed it with her. It was business as usual. Now Bruce was her only worry. The early summer of 2022 found Changsha with enough courage to finally tell Bruce who she really married. Perhaps she was surprised to realize that there was little reaction from Bruce. At this juncture of his life, he certainly had no desire to start anew. Besides, life was pretty pleasant, and he was not about to rock the boat. So a message was going forth from Changsha, and it should be, Honolulu, never mind. With complete peace of mind, Changsha now wants the world to know who she is, and the biography in the making, China's first transgender, is set to spell it out. Bruce has spent the summer writing it, with Changsha providing the data. With a number of details that challenge reality, it would be easy to accept this as a novel. Addendum. Despite having transgenderism in existence since ancient times, we are still seeking answers today to many of its causes and effects that have impacted thousands of individuals of both genders. The results of those who have opted for sex change surgeries have been a mixed bag. For the subject of this book, however, Zhang Kesha, it has been a blessing. In 1983, Kesha was denied twice by rulings, but then again, China had no law regulating such procedures. Only after a ruling from the Department of Health to assure its safety and the qualifications of his American-trained surgeon, it was a go. China exercised extreme caution and has done so since before 2009, when laws were enacted. For example, one must be an adult and be subjected to a lengthy period of time during which the individual must continue to express the desire to go through with a sex change operation. While China has set a good example for dealing with health and safety issues related to these surgeries, one has to wonder why America has failed to address the same criteria. Not a single national law is enforced to oversee and protect those that have expressed the desire to identify as a different gender. First and foremost, one should be at least an adult, and sadly such is not the case in a number of states. Subjecting underage children to risky, irreversible practices is criminal, and when many of them realize they made a mistake, the choice of suicide is not uncommon. Children are being indoctrinated even in schools, and often without parental consent. They are being convinced that they would be enjoying another sex other than the one they were born with. With cases that the U.S. Supreme Court chooses to hear or issue rulings, it is difficult to understand why this subject matter has not been brought to their attention. While states have leeway to enact many of their own laws, this is certainly one issue that should be dealt with on a national level. Sex change operations are simply misunderstood by most people. All such surgeries, and any number of hormone treatments will not change one's gender. The DNA that one is born with stays with that individual for life. The courts can rule whatever a person wishes to be, but biologically you remain the same. All such surgeries are simply elaborate and skilled cosmetic in nature.